As the war in Ukraine enters its second year, we wanted to understand what the war has meant outside of Europe and the US. So we gathered 4 of NPR's international correspondents together to discuss what effects the war has had in their regions and how the conflict is broadly viewed where they are. So here they are in conversation. West Africa correspondent Emmanuel Akinwotu, Latin America correspondent Carrie Kahn, China correspondent John Ruwich, and starting off the conversation is India correspondent Lauren Freyer.
So I flew into Ukraine a couple days after the war began, and I was part of the NPR team covering it. And I spent like a few weeks there. It felt like a year, but maybe it was just a couple weeks. And actually, what was more interesting for me was coming back to India and realizing that India, the world's biggest democracy, was not on board, horrified by the violence, yes, but wasn't condemning Moscow, wasn't on the same page at all. And it was so different from what I was seeing in Ukraine and what I was hearing in the Western media. That was my takeaway, actually, from covering the war in Ukraine, was coming out of Ukraine and seeing that in Asia. And I wonder if you guys had similar experiences in Nigeria or Mexico or Brazil or China.
Yeah, absolutely, Lauren. I felt like when the war started, I'm predominantly following it through, Western media or international media, Al Jazeera, the BBC. And I'm obviously following this from Lagos. I'm here in Lagos. But the vibe of it and the coverage of it and the commentary on it in Nigeria was different.
How?
There was immediately discussion about the ways in which the West had also played a part in provoking this.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
How does the West expect Russia to feel when NATO's border seems to be encroaching closer and closer to its own border? Mm-hmm. That was something that we heard over and over again. That yes, Putin, he's a madman. Oh, you can't predict what he's going to do. But the West too, NATO too, NATO expansionism, so there was the kind of opinions that would have been very uncomfortable in the UK or in the US.
Carrie was nodding her head emphatically when you were talking about the coverage.
Well, it's the same in Latin America. That disconnect that you're talking, Lauren, I feel it here all the time. We don't get the same sentiment, and especially with our leaders. At the start of the war, I was in Mexico, and now I'm in Brazil, and López Obrador, the president of Mexico, wanted to be a peacemaker and a broker and always talks about his non-interventionist policies and
Same with Prime Minister Modi. Yeah.
Yeah. And now in Brazil, with the return of Lula has said he wants to be the peace broker. He wants a peace club, he's talked about, together with Modi in India, and he's traveling to China. He says he's going to go to China, John, and he's going to talk to the leaders there and convince them to broker peace with him. I don't know. Do you even think that's possible?
Good luck with that. I mean, the Chinese are pretty clear that this war was provoked by the West and the United States to weaken Russia. The stakes are really high. China, first of all, sees all the Chinese government, I should say, sees all this kind of geopolitics through the lens of it's all about their relations with the West and the U.S., and they feel like they're being encircled. They feel like they're being held down. I mean, you can look at any number of examples. The new basing agreement that the U.S. has with the Philippines, they don't like that. The massive export controls against technology going to China that came in the fall, they don't like that. It's all part of the same chess game, the way that China sees it. But I wonder, this is actually something, listening to you guys talk, I wonder if there's if you guys are sensing any sort of tension, and maybe this is a dumb question because there's always tension. There's always, people always have sort of mixed feelings about things, right? But at least in China, where people are fed this steady diet of propaganda, mostly people believe the narrative, but there's also the skepticism about this kind of feeling of yeah, but, Vladimir Putin maybe shouldn't have invaded Ukraine, right?
Mm-hmm. Lula just said it the other day. He was, the German chancellor was just here. He was in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, and he was trying to get them all to come to his side and sell ammunition to Ukraine. And all of them just said, see ya, bye. No way, it's not happening. And Lula was pushed to the Western, look at his stance, and so Lula had to say, yes, it was a mistake. That's all I would say about Putin. It was a mistake.
Yeah. I mean, Modi won't even say that. Like, he will, he's called for a ceasefire. He's like condemned violence in general, but won't assign any blame. And like, part of it is just this deep anti-Western, the way India sees it, it's like, they remember the sort of warmongering leading up to the Iraq war that was based to U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, which was based on faulty intelligence. They remember how, like, the U.S. tried to drum up a big coalition for Afghanistan and then just pulled out of Afghanistan. Like, this is India's neighborhood, So these attitudes are formed over decades, and like, they don't change. And right after India got independence from the British, it became very close with the Soviet Union, like after Stalin died. And all of India's weapons are Russian. And I spoke with an analyst recently who was like, you know what? Indian defense experts and Indian pilots may be the only ones who are not surprised to see these Russian tanks falling apart in Ukraine, because they've had Russian weapons for years and they've been falling apart here. But the thing is, you can't, when your whole arsenal, and she had this brilliant anecdote. She's like, say my whole flat is decorated in IKEA. I can't just swap out one or two dining chairs. I've got to change everything. I've got to change the whole table and all the chairs. And it's true. Like, India is locked into this Russian military equipment, and you can't just diversify quickly. It's super costly and time consuming. And so that's,
I'm just
like,
gonna say, you can totally swap IKEA stuff out for other stuff. I just want to let you know that that's okay to do. Yeah, sure. I've done it.
At the point you made about oil. No, you didn't make the
let's
point
talk
about
oil.
But you talking just now just made me think about that, because I remember an interview, the Indian foreign minister,
S. Jaishankar. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was, I guess, being interviewed about India's position in this
about
war.
oil. Yeah.
Exactly. And their position on oil. And he was like really kind of unequivocal, like, India's going to buy Russian oil. No one's going to tell us not to buy
and he's
Russian
like,
oil.
that's my job. That is my
literally.
job as an Indian official to find bargains for my people on the global markets. Like,
Absolutely.
How dare you? And he had this, maybe this was in the interview you heard, or maybe he said this a couple times. Like, he's very populist, nationalist, but he has a point. He's like, that's all well and fine when your per capita income is 60,000 euros a year.
Right.
Yeah, you can go without some Russian gas. But how dare you tell me, when my people earn barely $2,000 a year, that I can't go for a bargain on oil when I have 6% growth this year and you have 0.5% growth? Like,
well, that's exactly what Bolsonaro did here in Brazil. He just weeks before the war, he went to Russia and talked to Putin in person, and he said, "Look, I gotta protect these fertilizer imports. Don't stop." And it was same populism.
Because it's food. This is food in Brazil. This is
yes.
So this is
life or death. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
absolutely. That interview, it echoed like what you have heard either insinuated from a lot of African countries or said outright. I feel like the war really kind of exposed to me in Africa these political tensions between African countries feeling like, I guess, tired about being seemingly lectured to by Western countries to fall in line in one way or another. And like India and like other countries, a lot of African countries are hugely reliant on Russian wheat, on grain, on so many commodities, and Ukrainian for that matter. I mean, they're not, I guess, mutually exclusive. Like they rely on these things, and they were priority areas. Some of the reasons why Russia and China have had some success in Africa, in at least if we measure the last like kind of like 8 to 10 years compared to some Western countries, is that they don't at least overtly lecture the countries on who they should have ties with.
Right.
They are not as concerned remotely with human rights, with any of that things that, that obviously has been a major part of US foreign policy in Africa. Actually, it's just like, this issue has really exposed a lot of these tensions, is what I'm trying to say.
That's so interesting. It's so much more multi-layered than sort of than as you were saying, that geopolitics, U.S. versus Russia, U.S. versus China, that type of thing, which is the way that I tend to see it, mostly because I covered China, that sort of big picture, like autocracies versus democracies, but there's, I mean, it does sound like that resonates a little bit when it comes to, hey, we're a democracy and we're going to lecture you about your autocracy and about human rights and about the way you should live your life. But to the side of that, there's other stuff. There's food, there's fuel, there's national pride, whatever the heck you want to call it, right? That complicates things, and that sort of, maybe that's where that sense of shock came from the U.S. side, where it's like, wait, you don't agree with us on this war?
But I think that I think it's just interesting listening to you all, and it all just seems very similar stories. I don't know, in the coming next year of the Ukraine war, I think in Latin America, it'll be like more of this pressure to condemn, get involved, sell ammunition, make up food stock supply chain problems. But it'll be interesting in Brazil to see if Lula can actually become the global leader, legacy warrior.
There's a lot of people lining up trying to do that. But okay, wait, are we doing predictions? So what's that prediction? 6 months out, 1 year out? Where are we?
Just like, what do you think? I don't know. What do you guys think you're looking for in the next year of the Ukraine war in your beat? I think inflation and food prices are a huge story in our patch, and food insecurity is rising and all that too. But I'm just curious to see how long they can keep up this independence from the West. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you see, Emmanuel, and your parts?
Yeah, it seems like this kind of like great power competition has kicked into like a new gear in Africa, with like the US government, kind of re-upping its engagement in African countries. And I think that broadly, inflation has been a major issue. Food insecurity has been a major issue. And broadly, how countries facing these issues have reacted has not actually led them to either condemning Russia or not condemning Russia. It's led them to having direct talks with Russia about how to get the grain here. One thing I've also noticed here is that the war's had a major impact on inflation around the world, right? But like, there are a few countries where their populations are not giving the government the benefit of the doubt, or are prepared to even listen to any excuse that the war has caused this inflation or the war has caused this economic strain. Like, for example, Ghana's inflation has rocketed. And the government has said over and over again, the impact of the war. And broadly, the population has grown more and more fed up with the government and don't believe this has really anything to do with the war. They think it's purely their own policies and this is economic mismanagement.
It's probably a little bit of both, right?
Exactly. And it is both. It is both. Exactly.
But as it drags on, they won't be able to use that excuse anymore. You hear that in Argentina, too. There's elections this year in Argentina. And how do you run for re-election at 100% inflation and say it's the Ukraine war in the second year? It's a tough one. Do your predictions, John. China.
My prediction, I would say, predictions are so dangerous. I don't know if I should make a prediction. I would
Not
not be
prediction,
surprised.
but what are you looking at? Like, what are you going to be looking for?
Well, I don't think this war is going to end anytime soon. I think from a Chinese perspective, first of all, the inflation stuff you guys are talking about doesn't, China's been kind of immune to it in a way because their economy has been so closed off from the world. Yeah, they still import a lot of goods, but as the Chinese economy, so this is totally an aside, but get ready for this. As the Chinese economy gets back on track, that's going to fuel more inflation. So keep your eyes open for that.
Really?
I think it will, because manufacturing hasn't fully ramped up yet and Chinese consumption hasn't ramped up yet. And that's going to hoover up a lot of commodities, a lot of things from around the world. So I wouldn't be surprised if the war dragged on. I don't think China doesn't like that. I don't think China hates that. I think that's okay for China. It distracts the West. I think if there's any sort of brokering of peace talks or a Chinese role or a role for third parties to get involved, that's going to be glacial unless there's a tipping point of some kind. So not very optimistic.
Interesting that you say that China actually benefits from this war continuing.
The Chinese government wants the war, says they want the war to end. They want peace, right? I think there's definitely ways in which they benefit, right? The pivot is delayed a little bit. The Ukraine's a classroom for the People's Liberation Army in a way. Not that they're there fighting, but they're learning a ton. They're probably getting good info from the Russians on how these systems work or don't work.
That's fascinating.
And they're paying close attention to, things that might work for them in Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's the same thing for India. Like, India benefits from cheap Russian oil, but overall wants the war to end, mostly because of food security and inflation. And frankly, India doesn't like being in the position where it has to keep defending Vladimir Putin. That just kind of is like a sucky position to be in these days, where to be best buds with Vladimir Putin. And India would really like that Asia pivot to finally happen. It wants the world to...
This is an important visit, but I want to back up to kind of set the foundation for why it's even happening as President Biden returns from his trip to Ukraine, marking the 1 year anniversary, the first anniversary of this war effort. How important was it for him to actually show up in person for this occasion?
Yeah, big surprise trip. You know, they've sort of been suggesting he might not even be able to go. The security be too brutal. So he sort of popped up there out of nowhere. A big show of support for Ukraine as well as for the president, Mr. Zelensky. And, Biden seemed thrilled, candidly, to be able to get there. And then he went for his previously planned trip to Poland, where he gave a speech trying to hold together solidarity. What is clear is that Joe Biden is trying to head off sort of weakening knees or fatigue among NATO and the West more broadly when it comes to supporting Ukraine in this fight. And he sort of warned in that Poland speech, like, hey, this is not going to be over tomorrow. Right. We are going to have to dig in here for the long haul, because it looks like Vladimir Putin is digging in for the long haul. So he's just trying to sort of hold it together, and it was sort of a very momentous occasion. And, the G7 on Friday spoke about this as well. So the big question will be sort of like what next will come in terms of support. And I think that's the context for Chancellor Scholz's visit to Washington in the coming week here. Secretary of State Antony Blinken this week says Ukraine will win this.
Putin's first objective was to erase Ukraine from the map, to erase its identity, to absorb it into Russia. That has failed and will never succeed. Now, there's a fierce battle going on for the territory that Russia has seized. Ukraine's gotten about 50% of what Russia's taken since last February.
In order for Ukraine to win the war, the U.S. needs Germany's support. This next visit, as we mentioned, Olaf Scholz this week, will be critically important. Is it all about Ukraine?
It seems to be pretty heavily about Ukraine. The White House hasn't given us full rundown yet, but Germany and the U.S. have been sort of the two-pronged head of the question of what arms and what types of arms you give to Ukraine. And remember, go back a year or even a little less than a year, and there were a lot of nerves in the West about if we give this type of tank, for instance, or this type of weapon or this type of missile, will that be seen as escalatory unnecessarily? Will Putin seize on that and use it as cover fire to escalate even further? So instead, they've tried to just do a slow boil, slowly adding different types of stuff. And now the crossroads that they're at is the question of fighter jets. When President Biden was in Europe, he faced calls and protests demanding F-16 jets, or asking for them, I guess I should say. And this is a big question right now. So I think that'll hang in the air. The Germans also have had similar concerns about being too escalatory when it comes to this stuff. The other stuff is just more basic blocking and tackling, Joe, where like in terms of ammunition. The U.S. is like concerned that they don't want to leave the Ukrainians with weapons that don't have anything to shoot out of them. Yeah, right. And I think we're starting to get to a place where the U.S. military, industrial production lines are starting to raise questions about, what can we produce? What do other allies have in their stocks? Have we emptied the cupboard? And if we've emptied the cupboard, are we making enough stuff to start rolling off lines to keep the Ukrainians armed? So I think we're getting into a little bit of that sphere. It is less flashy than, okay, we're going to give tanks for the first time, which of course the U.S. and Germany agreed to do recently, or we may or may not give fighter jets for the first time. But it's just as important, and I think it's fair to expect that that's going to be a big part of that conversation between the president and chancellor.
Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs, talked about the wish list that you're referring to.
Ammunition, tanks, long-range missiles, planes. These are the most wanted weapons on the list.
The most wanted weapons on the list. Of course, they're going to take whatever they can get. And by the way, they've been asking for fighter jets for the better part of a year, right? We were talking about MiG-29s potentially at the beginning of this. Yep. They haven't gotten them. Tanks may be rolling. But you wonder at this point if that's ever going to happen, or is it inevitable? And that we've seen this conversation where we kind of first start by saying no, then we say, well, that wouldn't be effective, and then we end up giving them exactly what they're asking for.
Right. It's like a parent who doesn't want to give a PlayStation
Kind
to
of.
their kid, right? It's like,
Right.
no, wait till you're 8, wait till you're 10. No, it does feel like the dial has moved steadily. And so the question is, will Joe Biden stop moving the dial? And he's been pretty categorical. He's not been saying, I don't know about F-16s, maybe, we're going to have conversations with our allies. He's been saying, no, we're not going to give F-16s. So he has not softened his position or left himself elbow room to do a quick 180 here. So if planes do arrive, the signals are that it won't be soon. Now, that said, there are lots of people calling for it. Allies might change their mind. Other countries might change their mind.
And calling for training. If you don't want to give them the jets, at least train them in case they get the jets.
Right, which is a big part of the equation as well. And in particular, will that training be done likely outside of Ukraine? So it gets a little logistically tricky.
What's the real worry, though, that Putin says, fighter jets, how dare you, let's start attacking Americans, or the potential for creep that, hey, once we go in the air, borders start to mean less. What happens if somebody gets shot down over Poland or, God forbid, missiles go in the wrong direction? Is that more of the concern?
Which we almost had a case of last fall, which it turned out to be a defensive missile that had landed in Poland but got everyone's hackles up there. I think that they are just worried that Putin would seize on it as rhetorically, as Biden has been very, very clear and left no wiggle room on U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine. No one is talking about that right now. But U.S. equipment being provided to the Ukrainians for the Ukrainians to fly, it's, if that is shot down, you lose the plane, a Ukrainian pilot would die, but it wouldn't necessarily trigger a crisis where American soldiers are dying and now Biden is in a politically tricky position.
Right.
It would, though, trigger a crisis if Joe Biden faces a situation where Vladimir Putin says, okay, this is now a bridge too far. Now they're flying your fighter jets. They're firing your missiles. They're firing your howitzers.
Not so much a proxy war
your
anymore.
tanks. I mean, how far are you willing to go here? I now consider this U.S. involvement. So that is why they're sort of tiptoeing down the hallway, trying to find the board that doesn't creak.
Wow, great line. When Olaf Scholz is here, is this a thank you for cooperating, or actually, Mr. Chancellor, we need a lot more from you? What's the conversation?
I think it's a thank you. Joe Biden has been pretty quick to defend Germany. There have been other countries that think that Germany has been a little soft on the hard military support. They've been more in the sort of sphere of financial support and that kind of stuff. Biden has really headed that off. He's really, frankly, moved to save face for Germany because I think Biden is of the mind that every country is going to be able to do what they're going to be able to do subject to their own domestic political concerns, right? So just like he doesn't want Germany finger-wagging America about what it or will not do, Biden has really stopped short of doing that. So I think it'll be a love-in, more or less. I mean, they are really in lockstep on a lot of these issues to the extent that there are disagreements. They're,
show of solidarity.
Right, full show of solidarity. Yeah. So we'll see more and more and more and more of that. Remember, in the background of this, it wasn't too long ago we were talking about fuel crises in Europe, and we still have lots of pressures in that regard. We could hear talk about that as well. There's questions about whether the U.S. can continue to sort of backfill Russian fossil fuels for Europe and for Germany in particular, and the infrastructure needed to do that. It's so complicated because, of course, the U.S. doesn't build LNG terminals or export terminals, for instance, because Joe Biden tells them to, so it's very complicated, but that energy side of it is going to be a big one as well, in part because Republicans